The average person saves for 40 years and retires with less money than someone who borrowed strategically for 10. Let that land for a second. Same time frame, same starting point. One person saved everything they had, the other borrowed, and the borrower won. Not because they were reckless, not because they got lucky, not because they had access to something you don't, because they understood something about money that nobody teaches in school, that your bank will never explain, and that most people spend their entire lives never figuring out. Debt, in the right hands, is not a trap. It is a tool. And today, we are going to show you exactly how it works. Not theory, not motivation, the actual mechanism. The borrowing secret that separates people who build wealth from people who spend their lives trying to save it. This is the bigger picture. Let me ask you something. What did your parents teach you about money? Not the details, not the specific advice, just the general philosophy, the underlying belief about how money works and what you should do with it. For most people, the answer sounds something like this: work hard, spend less than you earn, save the difference, avoid debt, be careful, be responsible. And that advice came from people who loved you, people who were doing their best with what they knew, people who genuinely wanted you to be okay. But here is the problem. That advice was designed for a different world, a world where savings accounts paid 5, 6, 7% interest, where a single income could support a family, where the cost of housing, education, healthcare grew at roughly the same pace as wages. That world no longer exists, and the financial playbook that worked for your grandparents is quietly failing an entire generation of people who are doing everything right and still falling behind. Here is what is actually happening. In the world we live in today, money has a cost. Interest rates, inflation, the gap between what assets cost and what wages pay. These forces are constantly moving, and they move differently depending on which side of the transaction you're on. If you are borrowing to consume, to buy things that lose value, to finance a lifestyle that exceeds your income, debt destroys you, slowly, consistently, exactly the way your parents warned you it would. But if you are borrowing to acquire, to buy things that generate income or appreciate in value, to use capital today to create more capital tomorrow, debt becomes something completely different. It becomes leverage, and leverage is how wealth is actually built in the modern economy. Not by saving harder, not by spending less, not by following the rules that were written for a world that no longer exists. By understanding that money, borrowed at the right rate, deployed into the right asset, can work harder than any amount of money you could save from a salary. This is not a secret available only to the wealthy. It is not a strategy that requires millions to execute. It is a principle, a fundamental understanding of how capital works that is available to anyone willing to learn it, and almost nobody teaches it, not because it is complicated, because the financial system profits more from people who save passively, pay fees quietly, and never question whether there is a better way. Let me show you exactly what I mean. The average savings account in the United States pays approximately 0.5% interest annually. The average annual return of the S&P 500 over the last 30 years is approximately 10.7%. The gap between those two numbers, 0.5 and 10.7, is not just a difference in returns. It is the difference between two completely different relationships with money. One where your money sits, waiting, slowly losing ground to inflation, and one where your money works, compounds, and grows in ways that saving alone could never produce. The wealthy understand this gap intimately. They do not keep large amounts of cash in savings accounts earning nothing. They deploy capital, they use leverage, they borrow at low rates to invest at higher ones, and they have been doing it quietly, consistently, for generations, while everyone else was told to save. Now here's where it gets interesting, because most people assume that using debt strategically requires access to special products, private banking relationships, or levels of wealth that make the whole conversation irrelevant for ordinary people. That assumption is exactly what the system wants you to believe. Because the tools of strategic borrowing are not hidden behind velvet ropes, they are available right now to almost anyone with a reasonable credit score and a basic understanding of how to use them. A mortgage on an appreciating property, a business loan that generates more income than it costs, an investment account that uses margins strategically and carefully. These are not exotic instruments. They are the everyday tools of people who build wealth consistently, while others save consistently and wonder why the gap between them keeps growing. In the next part of this conversation, we are going to look at exactly how this works in practice, not in theory, not in abstract, in the specific, concrete, real-world mechanisms that make borrowing a tool for building wealth rather than a trap for losing it. Let's get specific. Because I know what happens when financial content stays in the abstract. It sounds interesting, it feels relevant. And then you close the video, go back to your day, and nothing changes. So let's talk about real numbers, real mechanisms, real examples of how borrowing strategically actually works in practice. The first and most common example is real estate. Consider this. You have $50,000 saved. Option A, you keep it in a savings account earning 0.5% annually. After 10 years, you have approximately $52,500. The inflation-adjusted value of that money is actually lower than when you started. Option B, you use that $50,000 as a down payment on a $250,000 property. You borrow the remaining $200,000 through a mortgage. Now here is where it gets interesting. Over the next 10 years, the property appreciates at the historical average of approximately 4% annually. That $250,000 property is now worth approximately $370,000. Your initial investment was $50,000. Your gain, after accounting for the mortgage, is approximately $120,000. That is a 240% return on your original $50,000. Not because the property performed extraordinarily, because you used leverage. You controlled a $250,000 asset with $50,000, and the entire asset appreciated, not just your portion of it. This is the mechanism. This is what leverage actually does. It allows you to participate in the growth of an asset that is worth far more than the capital you personally deployed. Now I want to be clear about something important. This is not an argument for reckless borrowing. It is not a case for taking on debt you cannot service, or buying assets you do not understand, or stretching beyond what your financial situation can actually support. Every tool has a correct application and a dangerous one. A scalpel in the hands of a surgeon saves lives. The same instrument used carelessly causes harm. Leverage works exactly the same way, used deliberately on appreciating assets, with a clear understanding of the costs and risks involved. It is one of the most powerful wealth-building mechanisms available. Used carelessly on depreciating assets, without understanding the true cost of the debt, it accelerates financial destruction. The difference between those two outcomes is not luck, it is knowledge. And specifically, it is the knowledge of 3 questions that every strategic borrower asks before taking on any debt. The first question, what is the true cost of this debt? Not just the interest rate, the full cost, origination fees, insurance requirements, prepayment penalties, the total amount that will leave your account over the full term of the loan. Most people know the monthly payment. Almost nobody calculates the total cost, and the total cost is the only number that actually matters. The second question, what is the expected return on what this debt is financing? If you are borrowing at 6% to invest in something returning 10%, the math works in your favor. If you are borrowing at 22% on a credit card to buy something that returns nothing, the math destroys you every single month. The question is not whether to borrow. The question is always, what is the spread between the cost of the debt and the return on what it finances? The third question, what happens if things go wrong? Every investment carries risk. Every borrowed asset can lose value. Every income stream can be disrupted. The strategic borrower thinks about the downside before the upside. Not because pessimism is useful, but because understanding the worst-case scenario and ensuring you can survive it is what separates leverage from gambling. These three questions, applied consistently to every significant borrowing decision, are the framework that the wealthy use to turn debt into an asset, not a special framework reserved for the rich, a framework that anyone can learn and anyone can apply. Starting with the next decision they make about money. In the next part of this conversation, we are going to talk about the specific types of debt that build wealth and the specific types that destroy it, because not all debt is created equal, and knowing the difference is worth more than almost any other financial education you will ever receive. Not all debt is created equal. This is one of those statements that sounds obvious when you hear it, and is almost universally ignored in practice. Because when debt arrives in your life, it rarely arrives labeled. It does not come with a tag that says this will build your wealth or this will destroy it. It comes as a solution, an opportunity, a way to get something you want or need right now without waiting. And in that moment, the distinction between good debt and bad debt is the last thing most people are thinking about. So let's think about it now, clearly, before the moment arrives. Good debt has three characteristics. The first, it finances something that generates income or appreciates in value. A mortgage on a rental property that produces monthly cash flow, a business loan that funds equipment generating more revenue than it costs, a student loan for a qualification that demonstrably increases earning power. In each of these cases, the debt is financing an asset, something that produces a return, something where the value of what you acquired exceeds the cost of acquiring it. The second characteristic of good debt, its interest rate is lower than the return on what it finances. This is the spread we talked about in the last segment, the gap between what the debt costs you and what the asset earns for you. When that spread is positive, when the asset earns more than the debt costs, time works in your favor. Every month that passes, the asset grows, the debt shrinks, the gap between what you own and what you owe widens. That widening gap is wealth being built. The third characteristic, it is serviceable without stress. Good debt does not require you to stretch beyond what your income can comfortably support. It does not keep you awake at night. It does not eliminate your margin or remove your options. It fits within a financial structure that remains stable, flexible, and capable of absorbing the unexpected. Because unexpected things always happen, and the debt that seems manageable in good conditions can become catastrophic when conditions change. Good debt survives bad conditions. Now let's talk about bad debt. Bad debt also has three characteristics. The first, it finances things that lose value or generate no return. A car loan on a vehicle that depreciates the moment it leaves the dealership. A credit card balance carrying holiday purchases that were consumed months ago. A personal loan for a vacation that exists now only in photographs. In each of these cases, the debt remains. The thing it financed is gone, or declining, or generating nothing. You are paying interest on something that no longer exists in any financially meaningful sense. That is not leverage, that is erosion. The second characteristic of bad debt, its interest rate exceeds any possible return. A credit card charging 22% annually on a balance that is not financing any income-generating asset is not debt. It is a fee, a monthly penalty for having spent money you did not have on things that produced no return. And that fee, compounded over months and years, is one of the most efficient wealth destruction mechanisms ever created. The third characteristic, it accumulates invisibly. Bad debt grows quietly. Minimum payments create the illusion of progress while the balance barely moves. Lifestyle expenses charged monthly, paid minimally, compound into numbers that feel impossible to address. And because each individual transaction feels small, the cumulative weight of it builds slowly enough that most people never see it coming until they are already deep inside it. Here is the practical test. Before taking on any debt, ask yourself one question. 5 years from now? Will the thing this debt finance be worth more or less than the debt itself? If the answer is more, it is worth examining carefully. If the answer is less or nothing, it is bad debt. Almost no exceptions. This test does not require a financial degree. It does not require a spreadsheet or a professional advisor. It requires only the discipline to ask the question before the signature, not after. Because after is too late to change the answer. But before, everything is still possible. And in the next part of this conversation, we are going to talk about something that most people never consider when they think about borrowing. The hidden cost that bad debt imposes, not just on your bank account, but on your options, your freedom, your ability to say yes to the things that actually matter. Let me tell you about the cost that never appears on a statement. You can calculate the interest, you can add up the fees, you can project the total cost over the full term of the loan and arrive at a number that is genuinely shocking. But there is a cost that does not show up in any of those calculations. And it might be the most expensive one. It is the cost of the options you did not have. Let me explain what I mean. When bad debt consumes a significant portion of your income, something happens that is almost never discussed in financial content. Your decision space shrinks, not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, consistently, in ways that shape your life in ways you may never fully trace back to the debt itself. The job offer that would have been perfect, except the salary cut made the minimum payments impossible. The business idea that had real potential, except the capital required was unavailable because every available dollar was already committed to existing obligations. The health crisis that arrived and became a financial crisis simultaneously because there was no margin to absorb it. The relationship under pressure, not from incompatibility, but from the constant background stress of a financial situation that never quite gets better. These are not hypothetical scenarios. They are the lived experience of millions of people carrying bad debt who made individually reasonable decisions that accumulated into a structure that quietly eliminated their freedom. And the most painful part is that most of them never connected the dots. They experienced the job they could not take, the business they could not start, the opportunity they could not pursue, as separate events. Bad luck, wrong timing, not their moment. Not as the predictable consequences of a financial structure that had systematically removed their options. Here is a number that puts this in perspective. The average American household carries approximately $6,000 in credit card debt at an average interest rate of 20.4%. The minimum payment on that balance is approximately $150 per month. $150 per month, invested consistently for 30 years at 7%, becomes over $180,000. That is not a small number. That is options, real ones, the option to retire earlier, the option to weather a crisis without catastrophe, the option to take a risk that matters, knowing the financial foundation beneath you is solid enough to support it. $180,000 in options, quietly transferred, month by month, to a credit card company, by someone who was making the minimum payment, being responsible, doing what they were told. This is why bad debt is not just a financial problem, it is a freedom problem. And understanding it that way changes how you respond to it. Because the motivation to address bad debt, when it comes only from the interest rate or the balance, is abstract, intellectual, easy to defer. But when you see it as the thing that is quietly eliminating your options, month by month, decision by decision, possibility by possibility, it becomes personal, it becomes urgent, not in a panicked way, not in a way that leads to reckless decisions made from desperation, in the quiet, determined way of someone who finally sees clearly what they are dealing with and decides that the cost of continuing is higher than the cost of changing. That clarity is the beginning of everything. And in the next part of this conversation, we are going to talk about how the wealthy think about all of this, not just how they borrow strategically, but how they structure their entire financial life around a principle that most people never learn, until it is almost too late to apply it. Let me tell you how the wealthy actually think about debt, not how they are portrayed in the media, not the caricature of reckless excess or inherited privilege. How they actually think, the framework, the mental model, the specific way they evaluate every financial decision involving borrowed money. Because the difference between how wealthy people think about debt and how most people think about debt is not a difference in information. It is a difference in perspective. Most people think about debt from the liability side. How much do I owe? What is the monthly payment? How long until it is paid off? How do I get out of it as fast as possible? This perspective is not wrong for bad debt. It is exactly right. But wealthy people, when they are considering strategic debt, think from the asset side. Not what does this cost me, but what does this enable me to acquire, not how do I pay this off. But how does what this finances generate more than what this costs? Not how do I eliminate this obligation, but how do I structure this obligation so that someone or something else services it? That last point deserves its own moment, because it is the most powerful concept in strategic borrowing, and almost nobody outside of wealth management circles ever hears it stated clearly. The goal of strategic debt is not to pay it off with your income. The goal is to acquire an asset that generates enough income to service the debt itself. Let that sink in. A rental property that generates $2,000 per month in rent on a mortgage that costs $1,500 per month is not a debt you are paying. It is a debt that is paying itself and leaving you $500 per month in the process. Your income was never involved. You borrowed money. You acquired an asset. The asset services the debt. The asset generates profit. And your financial position improved without your salary being the primary driver. This is the mechanism. This is what wealthy people actually do. Not all of them, not all the time, and not without risk, careful analysis, and the discipline to execute correctly. But this is the framework, and it is available to anyone who understands it. Now let me address something that I know is forming in the back of your mind right now. This sounds great in theory, but I do not have the credit score, I do not have the down payment, I do not have the financial history that makes any of this accessible to me right now. That is a fair and honest response, and here is what I want to say about it. You are probably right that you cannot execute the full strategy today, but the gap between where you are and where this becomes possible is almost always smaller than it feels. Because the path to strategic borrowing begins not with finding the right asset, but with building the right foundation. A credit score above 700 opens doors that are closed below it, and moving from 600 to 700 requires no magic. It requires consistency, paying existing obligations on time, reducing utilization on existing credit, allowing time to work in your favor. A financial margin, even a small one, creates the possibility of a down payment, and a down payment, however modest, is the beginning of leverage. A clear understanding of the difference between good and bad debt changes every financial decision you make going forward, and every decision made correctly builds the foundation that makes the next level accessible. The wealthy did not arrive at strategic borrowing in a single move. They built toward it, decision by decision, year by year, starting from wherever they were, with whatever they had, understanding that the destination was worth the patience required to reach it. And in the next part of this conversation, we are going to talk about the specific steps that move you from where you are right now toward a financial structure that uses debt as a tool rather than carrying it as a burden. Because the distance between those two positions is not as far as it looks from where most people are standing. If you are still here, I want to stop for just a moment. Because what we have been talking about today is genuinely different from most financial content you will find. Most financial content about debt tells you one thing: avoid it, pay it off, get out of it as fast as possible. Debt is bad. Debt is dangerous. Debt is what happens when you are not disciplined enough to live within your means. And for bad debt, that advice is correct. But we went somewhere different today. We talked about debt as a tool, about leverage as a mechanism, about the specific way that wealthy people use borrowed money not to consume, but to acquire, not to spend, but to build. And that conversation was not one that most people ever have, not because it is secret, because it is not taught, not in school, not by most financial advisors who are incentivized to sell products rather than share frameworks, not by a culture that treats debt as a moral failure rather than a financial instrument. You stayed through that conversation, and that means something. It means you are willing to question what you were taught, to examine whether the rules you have been following were written for your benefit or for someone else's. That willingness is the most valuable financial asset you can possess, more valuable than a high income, more valuable than a perfect credit score, more valuable than any specific investment strategy or asset allocation or financial plan. Because without it, none of those things produce their full potential, and with it, almost any starting point can lead somewhere real. So if this conversation has shifted something, if something here has landed differently than most financial content you have encountered, I want to invite you to stay close to this channel. Subscribe, so the next conversation reaches you when it is ready, and share this with one person in your life who needs to hear it. Someone who has been told their whole life that debt is the enemy, who has been saving faithfully and wondering why the gap between where they are and where they want to be keeps feeling the same. This conversation might be exactly what shifts their perspective. And now, let's finish what we started. Because we have covered a lot of ground today. We talked about why the financial advice most people received was designed for a world that no longer exists. We talked about leverage and how controlling a large asset with a small amount of capital produces returns that saving alone could never generate. We talked about the 3 questions every strategic borrower asks before signing anything. We talked about the difference between good debt and bad debt and the simple test that separates them. We talked about the hidden cost of bad debt, the options it quietly eliminates, the freedom it slowly removes, month by month, decision by decision. We talked about how wealthy people think about debt from the asset side, not the liability side, and how the goal of strategic borrowing is never to pay it off with your income, but to acquire something that services itself. But there is one more thing, the thing that makes all of this actionable. Not for someone with $1 million and a private banker, for you, right now, with what you actually have, from where you actually are. Because the borrowing secret of the rich is not a secret that requires wealth to begin applying. It requires understanding, and you have that now. What comes next is the decision about what to do with it. I want to end with something honest. Everything we discussed today, the leverage, the strategic borrowing, the asset side thinking, the mechanism that makes debt a tool rather than a trap, none of it works without one thing: discipline, not the dramatic kind, not the white-knuckled, sacrifice everything, deprive yourself of any pleasure kind that most financial content romanticizes. The quiet kind, the kind that asks one question before every significant financial decision. Is this building something or consuming something? That question, applied consistently over time, is the filter that separates strategic debt from destructive debt. It does not require a financial degree. It does not require access to private banking or sophisticated investment products or a network of wealthy advisors. It requires only the habit of asking it and the honesty to answer it accurately. Because here is the truth about strategic borrowing that most people miss. It is not primarily a financial strategy, it is a thinking strategy. The wealthy do not borrow strategically because they have more money. They have more money, in large part, because they think strategically about borrowing. The thinking came first, the wealth followed. And that sequence, thinking first, wealth following, is available to anyone willing to change how they think about debt, not overnight, not without difficulty, not without the months where the discipline is hard and the progress is invisible and the voice in your head says this is not working, but consistently, inevitably, in the direction of something real. Let me leave you with a number. If you took the average American household's credit card interest payments, approximately $1,500 per year, and redirected that money into a diversified index fund, over 30 years, at the historical average return of 7% annually, that money becomes approximately $150,000. $150,000, not from a raise, not from a windfall, not from finding a secret investment strategy that nobody else knows about, from stopping the destruction of bad debt and redirecting that same money towards something that builds. That is the borrowing secret of the rich, stated as simply as it can be stated. Not that they borrow more, that they borrow differently and stop borrowing entirely for things that destroy. You now understand the difference. You understand leverage and how it works. You understand the three questions that separate strategic debt from reckless debt. You understand the hidden cost of bad debt, not just in dollars, but in options and freedom and the decisions that were never available because the margin was already gone. You understand how wealthy people think about this differently, and understanding, applied with consistency and patience, changes outcomes, not immediately, but inevitably. Start with one decision. Look at the debt you currently carry. Ask the question honestly, is this building something or consuming something? And let the answer guide what comes next, not perfectly, not all at once, but deliberately, with the clarity of someone who finally understands the system they are operating inside and has decided to use it differently. If this conversation has been worth your time, share it with 5 people who are carrying debt right now and have never been told that the way they think about it might be the most important variable of all. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you want to understand next. What part of your financial life still feels like a locked room? Ask it here. Because the next conversation starts with what you need most. This is the bigger picture: money, wealth, and the life you're building. We'll see you in the next one.